Mike Evans is a passionate environmentalist who has billions of dollars at his disposal after inheriting his father's oil company. In the third episode of Three Body Problem, we watch him read Little Red Riding Hood to a disembodied voice in a speaker he calls My Lord. It can't comprehend why the girl isn't aware that the wolf intends to eat her after they've communicated. From their perspective, thoughts are communication, so the idea that humans can lie is troubling. Evans tries to reassure the voice that this is exactly why they need him so that they can better understand humans. He's already sealed his fate though. When asked, he didn't lie, and admitted that we all do it sometimes one way or another. This leads to an ending as they decide to cease communication, saying that they can't coexist with liars. In the same episode, we learn the voice is a representative of the Santi, a race of aliens that had the misfortune of evolving on a planet with 3 suns. A classic three-body problem that the embodiment of the voice that Jack and Jyn meet in the video game explains is unsolvable, and worse, it means that their civilization is doomed. Their only chance at survival was to find a new home, so imagine how thrilled they were to get a response from Red Coast Base in Wenjie. That was the end of humanity thinking it was alone in the universe. And and Evans started an organization to welcome our invaders because they believed that as a species we'd lost the ability to solve our own problems, or save ourselves. When I first read Cixin Liu's epic sci-fi series Remembrance of Earth's Past, this was one of the major hooks for me. While it initially was surprising that Ya answered after she received a warning, it started to make sense the more I thought about it. Even more so as the movement starts to grow and more people start to welcome the idea of invasion, which seemed counterintuitive, counter to the survival instinct even. But when I thought about the state of things, I realized that this is something that would happen in our world too. And this gets to what I liked best about the series, and the one thing I was really hoping that the TV adaptation could get right. Even though their system is relatively close to ours if you're thinking on a galactic scale, it will still take them 400 years to get here. That slow motion ticking clock removes the individual from the equation because we don't live that long, and it makes it generational. What would you do if you found out aliens were coming to the Earth is a fine question. But what would society or humanity do if they found out aliens would be here in 4 centuries? That's a different thing to think about entirely because most invasion stories are about crisis response. Everyone puts their differences aside and fights together for the preservation of humanity. Would that still be the case? Could they keep that up for 400 years? What would the effect be on the generations that live and die before they get here? That they can come here is proof they're more advanced than us. Not to mention some of the technology we're going to talk about in this video. Could they be convinced there's a reason to keep us around? And if you've never read the books, I won't be giving away future spoilers in this, but I will say this is a very long story. And if the show tells us something, I won't shy away from pointing it out, and common sense would tell you that they didn't spend so much time on the monkey in stasis, and have Wade say that he was going to more or less go to sleep until the Santi arrive, if they weren't going to use that. To get back to the ending of Season 1, that is a 2-part affair. While Netflix's version focuses primarily on the first book, they move some elements forward to introduce some of the key characters that weren't introduced until later books. For the most part, this doesn't change the story because those books use flashbacks to connect things. The biggest changes are related to location and the number of characters. This is a book series by a Chinese author, and most of what happened in the first 7 episodes took place there instead of London. And most of the Oxford 5 storyline revolved around a single character rather than a group of friends. The reason I say the ending happens in 2 parts is because the end of the first book happens in episode 7, with episode 8 introducing us to the beginning of the second. Episode 7 starts with a request from a dying friend. No matter what happens, Will doesn't want Saul to tell Jyn that he's the one who bought her the £19.5 million star. And we are talking about currency, not its weight here, from the windfall he got after their snack mogul pal Jack passed away. If only Will's Weasley sister knew about that rather than the inheritance he got from their mother. We see Will reach the end of his life, but not the end of his story, because most of this episode is focused on the Staircase Project, which was initially going to use nuclear explosions and a solar sail to accelerate a capsule containing a human to a speed that would match that of the approaching Santi fleet. It could rendezvous with them 200 years before they got to Earth. But even though Jyn's plan and Augie's nanofiber sail could make this work, there aren't enough bombs available, so they're forced to lighten the payload. In the end, they can only send a brain because it doesn't weigh that much, and that is the thing that makes us human. And Will turns out to be the best candidate because of his scientific background and the fact that he's dying already. The personal connection here turns out to be a test for everyone. Jyn's motivation for working with Wade was to fight back, and Augie only came on board to help her do that. Involving their dying friend was too much and led to her leaving the project. On her way out, she uploads all of her work to make it available to everyone, screwing over her investors, and takes off to Mexico, where she tries to put it to better use by making water purifiers for local villages. Jyn's situation is more complicated, and even though she goes to try to talk Will out of donating his brain, he figures out that he's probably the only candidate they have and lets her off the hook by accepting anyway. His motivation is pure. He'd do anything for her and knows she can't ask even if she wants the project to succeed. He's been struggling to tell her he loved her throughout the season because every scenario he imagined wouldn't work out and would just ruin their friendship. This final act provides him the moment to tell her how he really feels in a situation where it reinforces their bond rather than tearing them apart. He accepts the offer but refuses to sign a loyalty oath to humanity. This gives him a chance to explain that the only reason he agreed is that he trusts Jyn. And while you might think this would be a problem for Wade, he's actually happy about it. He tells Jyn later that in wavering, he probably made it more likely that the Santi will go out of their way to pick him up. And he also lets her know that Will was the one that bought her the star, which leads to her trying to see him before his end and getting there too late. While the Jyn scene packed an emotional punch, his final moments with Saul work as the highlight for the character. To this point, they really hadn't touched on why this was such a dangerous idea, and I thought they did a great job of having Saul lay that all out in an attempt to get him to change his mind, while still being there for his friend and respecting his wishes. Having your brain picked up by a hostile alien race that wants to figure out how to eradicate your species is nightmare fuel, especially if they're advanced enough to return you to consciousness. You don't even get to die in that scenario. It seems like they made an effort to present Saul as a guy that you shouldn't take too seriously or even pay that much attention to in the first season. He might be smart, but he's way more concerned with getting high and getting laid and having a good time. This scene highlights what a good actor Jovan Adepo is, which is very promising as we see Saul becoming more central to the story. And it's a good send-off for Will. Jack made an early exit and wasn't around long enough for us to really miss what he brought to the story. But they invested a good bit of this season building Will up, and I think the way his last moments land here is also promising. The other character who meets her end in episode 7 is the one we started the story with way back in the 1960s. Now that she's been released from custody, we find Ya at home and see from one of her pictures that the girl in the game was based on her daughter Vera. Of all the characters and endings we've discussed, Ya has had the most of them. She lost her father and her freedom during the Cultural Revolution. She lost her faith in humanity and then in the Santi, which hits hard because they're now coming to wipe us out. And she lost her daughter, who discovered the role she played in that and couldn't go on living. Vera was what connected the Oxford Five in the first place, and because Mike Evans was her biological father, him coming out for her funeral was what put him back on Wade and Dusha's radar. The fact that someone with such a high profile could manage to keep themselves out of the public eye for so long was one of the first clues to how the Santi were able to use their technology to stay ahead of humanity. Vera's suicide came on the heels of their interfering with experiments, causing a panic because the laws of physics appeared to be unraveling. While some of these deaths were suicides related to that revelation, and others were carried out by humans doing the Santee's bidding, as we saw with Jack's death in episode 3 after he refused to continue in the game, Vera's was more about her mother's choices. And in her final episode, Ya is trying to make up for failing as her mother. Abandoned by her lord, she reaches out to Saul, who her daughter always said was the smartest of the bunch. They meet at Vera's grave, where she tells him a joke that he doesn't immediately understand the importance of. The most effective technological advantage the Santee holds over humanity is the Sofons, which the game avatar with the katana and the super awesome voice, who we also will later find out is named Sofon, explains to Wade and Jyn at the end of episode 5. A Sofon is a single proton they have turned into a sentient computer. This is possible because there are more dimensions than the 3 we occupy in the universe, and the Santee have the means to access them. When they unfold the subatomic particle, it becomes as big as a planet, and from there they can engrave circuitry on its surface to turn it into a massive supercomputer. Then they can fold it back up to its original size that's invisible to the naked eye. They have the resources to make 4 total, meaning they have 2 entangled pairs so that when they send 2 of them to Earth, they're able to communicate in real time and thus faster than the speed of light because of quantum mechanics. And because a proton has virtually no mass, they can accelerate it close to the speed of light, which is how the Sofons could get here so much quicker than their fleet. This is how they can always watch everything that's happening on Earth, and to add an additional layer of existential dread, they enfolded one around the planet with a giant eye watching on it to drive it all home. This is not just because they like to play with their prey. While they possess a significant technological advantage right now, because of the volatility of their environment, they advance at a much slower pace. The 400 years that will take them to arrive would be plenty of time for us to catch up, so they need to destroy our science to halt our progress. Basically, they plan to inject some of the chaos they experience naturally into our otherwise stable existence. Humans won't have the same chance to evolve and adapt as the Santee, who can dehydrate themselves during chaotic eras and start over when conditions improve. The Sofons are why Ye tells Saul the joke that isn't very funny, and here she's counting on them not being able to pick up on the deeper meaning. This is something that is very easy to figure out if you've read the book. In that version of the story, she just comes out and says what she wants to tell him. So while I think it's a novel idea for her to do it this way, and it kind of makes a little more sense, I can't speculate when I know the answer. I suppose a hint would be to think about who Einstein and God might represent in this scenario, and about the books she picked up right before she decided to make the call. I mentioned the ending of us believing we were alone in the universe, and the idea of why we thought that in the first place, in a universe that's so vast it would be impossible for us to be the only intelligent life that ever developed, is something this series attempts to tackle. It proposes a solution to the Fermi paradox, and that drives a lot of what happens as it moves through time. After meeting with Saul, Yad decides to return to Red Coast Base, and because it's where everything started, it's a fitting place for her to end her life. It's a bit of a surprise when Tatiana shows up, but I'm really glad she does. I haven't had a chance to touch on her role, which I think she delivers one of the standout performances of the series in. She grew up in Evan's organization as a true believer and became one of the Santee's most effective tools. She was primarily a mysterious stranger who kept popping up and doing important things, only to be tossed to the side once they stopped talking to Evans, and allowed Wade and Clarence to arrest most of his followers in episode 4. While she's been ordered there to kill Ya, when she confronts her, she promises that she's got something much more beautiful in mind than letting her plummet to her death over the edge of the cliff. You tend to believe her, and while she doesn't know exactly why this is the time it has to happen, she says that Ya has fulfilled her purpose, which is in a weird way kind of soothing. It's a bit of peace before they sit and enjoy one final sunset that is in a way symbolic of the sun setting on humanity. If Will's final moments with Saul didn't get to you, then Tatiana putting her head on Ye's shoulder should push you over the edge. With Mike Evans' story coming to a dramatic close at the end of episode 5, and Ya exiting the story here, the Santee's ties to humanity have shifted. The narrative of the book is divided into eras, with everything up to the Judgment Day being sliced to bits by Augie's nanofibers being referred to as the Common Era. And after the revelation the Sofons were watching everything, the Crisis Era begins. This is where we can loop back around to Little Red Riding Hood and the discovery of lies. Episode 8 opens by shifting its focus to Saul, who apparently can't remember his one-night stand's name. As I've already mentioned, this is par for the course for the character, but one thing that stands out here is that even though he's portraying this nihilistic view of what's going on, you can see that internally he's conflicted. Unfortunately for his lover, she won't get to see him turn things around, because as they argue about the state of the world, there's a terrible accident where she's hit by a car and dies. Saul only survives because a skateboarder bumps into him and knocks him down seconds before the car hops the curb. This lands him in front of Clarence, who tells him that the car was of the hacked self-driving variety, and it was almost certainly meant to kill him, which might not be a one-off event, because he also mentions that Ya was found murdered in China, which makes it sound like there are new recruits out there ready to take the place of Evans and his followers. Clarence is another character I haven't had much to say about. He's been central to the story, but he had this abrasive personality in the book that gave him a much larger presence. In the show, he comes off as competent, but his laid-back personality made it so he almost disappears into the mix of things. For that reason, I was happy to see that pairing him up with Saul lightens him up a bit. This is also promising for the future because we find out here that Da Shi's new job is to keep Saul safe. One of my favorite things about the finale is the way Saul is just sort of taken back from the absurdity of what's happening to him. There are bulletproof clothes, private planes, and a fighter jet escort. They end up at the UN headquarters where Secretary Joseph announces the Wallfacer Project, and this is where that Little Red Riding Hood story comes back into play. The Secretary says we are at war. The battle might be centuries away, but the enemy has declared war upon us and we must defend ourselves. Because the Sofons can see whatever they want, whenever they want, the only way to keep the plan to fight back a secret is to keep them inside the Wallfacers' heads, because the Santee can't read minds. This is something that Wade came up with in episode 7, and the name Wallfacers is a reference to monks who stare at a wall while meditating. Of course, Saul has no idea why he's been picked for this and wants no part of it, but once he's been named a Wallfacer, the point is that no one knows exactly what your plan involves. He keeps trying to quit, but they just sort of smile politely because this could all just be part of his plan. This grants him Da Shi as his bodyguard. He gets an assistant who is willing to get him anything he asks for, and gets access to the combined resources of the United Nations. He eventually gets them to let him leave, and promptly gets shot by a would-be assassin as soon as he goes outside. Luckily, he's still wearing his bulletproof clothes and will recover. He asks to meet with his shooter, who self-describes as a soldier in the army of the Lord. The other Wallfacer candidates make a lot more sense. A general who is a war historian, and a professor who is also a Kurdish war hero who fought against ISIS and is an expert in asymmetrical warfare. The Secretary General can only tell him that the enemy knows why he was chosen. It's not even certain that she knows why they picked him. As viewers, we know it's because Ya wanted to meet with him before she went back to China. And then we can put 2 and 2 together that whatever she was trying to convey in the joke will probably be important. To have him be one of just 3 people that humanity depends on to figure out this impossible situation is a good setup for the next phase of the story. And it's also good news that it appears that Tatiana will be playing a large role too. We see a final scene with her where she returns to her RV to find one of the gaming headsets. It comes with a card reading, "If one of us survives, we all survive," which is an echo of what Sofon said when she was explaining the Santee dilemma inside the game. It would seem that the aliens are pinning some of their survival hopes on this true believer, and out of all the characters we've met, I'd say they've probably made a good choice. Plus, she's a scene stealer, so it's good to see they're keeping her around. In less compelling news, Jyn and Raj's relationship doesn't look like it'll survive into the 2nd season. While they're on Wade's jet, he asks if she dumped him and forgot to tell him, and I can only think let's hope so. He continues by asking if it's about Will, which it is, and after they debate whether he's still alive or not, he asks if she loved him, and she corrects that saying that she loves him, and that he's still alive. If you were a Raj fan and wanted to see more, I wouldn't worry. Even if he's not in a relationship with Jyn next season, I'm pretty sure he'll play a significant role elsewhere in the story. And while I didn't find their relationship that interesting, it is worth mentioning that she kinda does him wrong here. She could blame that all on the staircase project though, which starts off great, but ends failing miserably. Even though this was very tricky and rushed without any real testing, it still feels a little surprising to end the season on a very expensive, colossal failure. Now Will's brain is just traveling forever into deep space. I mean, at least he's got those seeds. He does like his spicy food, but it's a downer ending for a character who ended up being quite likable. And it feels like it shuts the door on Jyn ever realizing her true feelings. Wade is the final character I haven't said much about. He's the guy who is pulling all the strings. They never really explain who he answers to or how he came to be in the vaguely described most elite intelligence operation out there. We do see that it has a pretty kick-ass headquarters. And he's a guy that can get you 300 atomic bombs if you need them. And as I mentioned, he was one of the architects of the Wallfacer project. He also has the Santi's attention, as we see when Sofon pays him a visit on his private jet. She's sorry they won't get to meet Will, and says that they're looking forward to meeting him when they arrive. She brings up his hibernation technology and adds that human beings are so fragile. I probably don't need to mention it because it came up a couple of times, but just in case, remember that she appears in this human form because we might find their true appearance unsettling. The only thing we ever learn about them is that they communicate with their thoughts in real time, which gives them characteristics of a hive mind, and that they can dehydrate themselves during crisis periods. Some of the book is written from their point of view, but their actual appearance is never confirmed. Initially, Sofon appears on his TV, which is consistent with how she showed up in the game, but she ends the conversation by appearing in person right in front of him. She promises him that they'll always be watching until the day he dies, and he sees a countdown like Augie's briefly before having a vision of himself with his eyes gouged out sitting next to him. After the Project Staircase debacle, Jyn and Saul retreat to their hotel to get drunk. They discuss uplifting things like the fact that it'll be millions of years before Will leaves the Milky Way, and then Clarence arrives to try to get them to snap out of it. One of my nitpicks about this show is that I think at times it tries to be funny, with mixed results, but I did laugh at Saul saying, sometimes being depressed is an appropriate reaction to whatever's going on in the world. It's such a nerd thing to say. He also brings up the idea that we're bugs, which is the message the Santi sent to humanity right before they unfolded the Sofon at the end of episode 5. This also came from the Mike Evans conversation when he called Wade and his intelligence officers pests, annoying, inconsequential creatures that are easy to kill. I don't know that those conversations presented the aliens as having a personality, but this is such a perfect way to demoralize humanity. Take the next 400 years to think about how we're going to stomp on you and crush you. If the goal is to take a humanity who has gotten too comfortable and make them fear again, this is a great way to start. Clarence isn't ready to give up though. After all, they're at war. He tries to point out the achievements of the failed project, and then he takes them on a drive to a nearby marsh where swarms of cicadas are everywhere. Humans may be bugs, but bugs are hard to get rid of. He says people hate bugs, been trying to get rid of them forever. Look around, they're not going anywhere. Then he pours out some rum for the bugs and tells Saul and Jyn that they've got work to do. The camera pulls away and there are just so many bugs as it cuts to black, and the first season comes to an end. So as a big fan of this book series and a big idea sci-fi stories in general, I had a lot of expectations going into this. I was cautiously optimistic because the early seasons of Game of Thrones are just so good, and most of what I saw related to the adaptation seemed like they were bringing up things that I wanted to hear about, things I wanted to eventually see. It seemed like they had a good grasp on what they were trying to recreate. My biggest concern was this idea of making the story appeal to the broadest audience possible, because if you watch my channel, you know those aren't the kind of projects I'm usually drawn to. I can understand why they would do that, but I wasn't sure that it was going to be for me. On my first watch, I thought things felt a little unbalanced between the flashbacks and the modern day scenes. At times, it felt like two different shows, with the one that was taking place in the past having a lot more texture and character. Moving things to London was also a little jarring because part of the appeal reading the book the first time was that as a Westerner, China almost feels like a different world. It's perfect for sci-fi in that way. But as much as I like reading sci-fi, I also like good TV. And as much as I like these books, there were some obvious things an adaptation would have to address to make them work as a TV show. There was a moment in the middle where I wasn't sure if it was going to come together in a satisfying way. But I thought the last 2 episodes were really strong, and I'm excited for a second season. I think they captured the essence of what makes the story compelling. I hope that they nail the dread that's inherent to such a long wait for the invasion and hit the demoralization that sets in after the "you are bugs" moment. I think they did that, and I think it opens the story up to a larger audience. These books sit with you after you finish, and I think the show will do that for people too. I imagine it won't be what every reader was hoping to see, but I think it will bring a lot of new readers to the books, which in my mind is a good thing. It's not perfect, but it's very promising, and I know the story just keeps getting better from here. I'm actually a little jealous of people who are getting introduced to these ideas for the first time. It's been years since I first read the series, so it's easy to forget how they changed the way I thought about our place in the galaxy, and how we would react when we found out that we weren't alone. This show succeeds in giving you that, and based on the decisions they made, I think the next season will be even better, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.